So one of the great things about being located in a college like this, being located in Cambridge, is that we get to work with so many great young people. And not just from this university, but also from many others, including our near neighbours at Anglia Ruskin University. And we heard at the end of the last session from Hattie, who asked a question. Hattie has been volunteering in the Archive Centre. She's a student at ARU. And she's also very kindly recorded a short video for us about her experience of volunteering with us in conservation. So we're going to play that now. Thank you, Hattie.
My name is Hattie. I'm a third-year Anglia Ruskin history student, and I've been doing some volunteering here at the Churchill Archive Centre since January. One of my favourite objects at the Churchill Archive Centre has to be one of Baroness Trumpington's wedding albums. I love weddings. I find them so fascinating. I love the wedding dresses. I love everything about them. And just being able to look at her wedding photos and her photos from when she bought her first house, her first dog, when she went on her honeymoon, and there's pictures of her first child there. It was just such an interesting experience. And I was doing some cleaning on it, so I was able to actually get a proper look at the photos and look at the condition that they were in, things like that, and I just found it incredibly interesting.
Okay, well, those shots of that wedding album, that choice of yours, Hattie, sets us up perfectly for our next presentation. Partly because that video and the others you've been watching in our 50 Stories for 50 Years series were created, produced, edited by our next speaker, Cherish Watton. And partly because Cherish is doing her own PhD here at Churchill on a history of scrapbooking and life writing in Britain in the 20th century. Yesterday we heard Alex Green talk about collaborations between archivists and historians. Cherish is really a walking one-person collaboration. When not working on her PhD, we're proud to have her as a member of the Archive Centre team, where she has helped transform our communications and public engagement. And somehow, in addition to all of this, she also manages and runs the Female Land Army website. And of course, we saw a Land Army girl in Claire's film footage a minute ago. So, Cherish, over to you.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Alan. I'm really thrilled to be here to share some of my PhD research. Back in 2016, in my final year as an undergraduate, I met a PhD student who was studying a series of scrapbooks made by the Scottish poet Edwin Morgan. On a podcast together, I was intrigued by how the now Dr. Bridget Moynihan had turned to scrapbooks as historical sources in and of their own right. These were places where anyone could take scissors and paste to say something about their lives and the world around them, often turn into ephemeral materials such as newspaper clippings, magazine cuttings, photographs, or food packaging. They function simultaneously as forms of life writing, collecting, and archiving. And as Bridget explains, scrapbooks had long been ignored by historians because of their feminine associations, dismissed because of the assumption made about the worthless nature of their contents, not helped by the very name, scrapbook. Fortuitously, I met Bridget just as I was considering postgraduate study. So after our discussion, I scoured archives catalogues here in Cambridge and discovered that just round the corner from where I was living at Lucy Cavendish College, Cambridge, there was an array of scrapbooks in the stacks here at Churchill Archive Centre, made by the likes of Mary Churchill, Julian Risdale, Enoch Powell, Peggy J, Barbara Rankin, Sir Alfred Duff Cooper, just to name a few. Then, as now, scrapbooks can be found across our political, diplomatic, and social science collections. Fast forward a year then, and I had narrowed down my research a bit and decided to look at the history of scrapbooking by elite women on diplomatic and political life, funded by the Archive Centre studentship very generously. So these included the scrapbooks of one of the first female Conservative politicians, Florence Horsburgh, which arrived at Churchill Archive Centre in a trunk in 1970, along with a key sent by her brother a few weeks later. And as you can see, these are very ordered collections of newspaper clippings, each with the date of publication and the blue paper of the press cuttings agency where the publication had come from. And Horsburgh, we think, had filed these clippings away into a series of scrapbooks, carrying roles such as scraps, perhaps a hint at the to and fro of political debate. I also spent some time looking through a series of scrapbooks made by Adeline Hankey on her husband, Maurice Hankey's career as one of the first cabinet secretary and his political work alongside the key role he played during the First World War as one of David Lloyd George's aide. And these were actually used by Stephen Roskill, when writing his 3-volume biography, Man of Secrets. And you can see Adeline had filed away lots of ephemeral material, such as clippings, newspapers, as well as photographs, as well as an autograph of the French boxer Georges Carpentier, which you can see in the bottom left-hand corner with a little note on how she managed to collect it. Unusually, this scrapbook was then sent back to Adeline in 1969, describing it as the next best thing to her husband, who had passed away 7 years before. And that's just a hint of some of the emotions that these scrapbooks represent to their families. For Horsburgh, then, the scrapbook offered a way for her to record her own political career, while for Hankey, it allowed her to record her husband's, as well as her own family's work, functioning, therefore, as a part sort of professional, part family record. Coming to the end of my MPhil research then, I realised that this was clearly the tip of the iceberg for a much larger project, the history of scrapbooking in Britain during the 20th century. Now, while indebted to the earlier forms of the commonplace book and album, in the 20th century, Britons transformed the scrapbook, diversifying and expanding the range of purposes it could serve in response and in dialogue with new forms of media and leisure. Scrapbooking wasn't just a Victorian tradition, as the literature would lead us to believe, but was thriving and emerging in new ways in the 20th century. Scrapbooking was so popular that the BBC actually named one of their most famous radio programmes Scrapbook after the practice. And scrapbooks offered their makers a degree of freedom not possible with diaries or photograph albums, which carried kind of pre-conventions over how they should store content. The possibilities were endless with a scrapbook. So through a series of case studies on local rural history, the royal family, and the war, my PhD will hopefully offer the first cultural and social history of scrapbooking in Britain. It seems appropriate then, at a conference celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Churchill Archive Centre, that we consider a more popular and accessible form of archiving, which was taking place beyond the walls of institutional archives. At a time which I think has come up repeatedly in our presentations, thinking about the archive before it arrives to us in the reading room. As the scrapbook scholar Ellen Gruber-Garvey has explained, scrapbooks are a type of archives in and of their own right, where their makers save, organise and categorise material, essentially functioning as an archive in miniature. Scrapbooks have frequently been described as amateur or rogue archives, but we actually need to think of them as archives in and of their own right, made by people who are the experts on their own lives. Scrapbooks then were an everyday archive, available to anyone who had access to a book, scissors and paste. So from viscountesses to vicars, schoolchildren to soldiers, radio stars to researchers, scrapbooking was a popular practice. Now, going back now to October 2020, when I started my PhD, obviously still with lots of restrictions in place, Churchill Archives was one of the first archives that I could visit. And their catalogue promised a really interesting set of scrapbooks on the history of the First World War, which would speak really nicely to one of my chapters. So I first came across a series of 8 scrapbooks, which you can see on the screen here, made by the second Viscountess Esher, Eleanor Brett, on the First World War. In her scrapbook diary, she recorded what her work during the war looked like, from coordinating the awarding of grants for the Territorial Relief Fund to running ambulance units and visiting hospitals in France. And on a double-page spread, she glued her diary entry for the week, illustrated with various newspaper clippings, photographs, signatures, leaflets, and other ephemeral material, such as flowers, which she and her husband Reginald had collected from the trenches. In family publications and biographies on her husband Reginald, an influential courtier and historian, Eleanor is characterised as an intelligent woman who nonetheless played the role of the subservient wife, given really very little agency. To the contrary, her scrapbooks show her confidently proclaiming her own endeavours, independently from that of her husband. This series of scrapbooks then was really interesting for me, thinking about their scrapbooking as a form of war writing, as well as thinking about the relationships between diaries and other forms of scrapbooking. But then, another large donation of archival material arrived at Churchill Archive Centre, and this reveals really that Eleanor was joined in her scrapbooking activities by her husband, Reginald, the second Viscount Esher, their son and heir, Oliver, and his wife, Antoinette. And archival material outside of Churchill shows that Oliver's sister, Sylvia, and Dorothy also made scrapbooks as children and later on in their lives. So together with correspondence, logbooks, and diary notes, members of this family kept over 50 scrapbooks. This was one of the largest collections of scrapbooks made by a single family that I've come across during my research, making this a really unusually rich collection for me to have a look through. So scrapbooking here was a familial practice carried out by male and female members of this family across 2 generations, covering the period roughly from 1899 to 1960, appearing to wane a little when Lionel Brett became the 4th Viscount Esher in 1962. However, even Lionel used the family's scrapbook collections when writing his autobiography, Ourselves Unknown. These scrapbooks then were family objects that fulfilled a variety of purposes for connecting and constructing a history of this family across several generations. Here's just another way to kind of see some of those scrapbooks on a timeline. This was then an enduring and pervasive practice, which I think invites us to consider this more seriously. In today's paper, then, I want to use just 3 scrapbooks made by members of this family as a prism through which to consider family archiving practices. I want to suggest that by approaching these scrapbooks as family archives in miniature, they challenge our understanding of the gender dynamics of aristocratic archival labour, or what it means to actually physically make an archive, and who is doing that. Now, certainly some of the scrapbooks conform with some of our gendered nature of family archiving practices, which we'll consider as women document their lives of their children, self-effacing their own work in the process. But I also want to show that there are limits to this characterisation, with some women using scrapbooks as a way to proclaim their own endeavours, while male family members amassed volumes which recorded their families as much as themselves. These scrapbook collections then show that there is not such a neat gendered division in family archives practices, which we might expect. Now, interestingly, none of the family appear to refer to their collections as scrapbooks, a book in which a range of mixed media is added onto the pages. Instead, Eleanor Esher refers to her 8 diaries I mentioned at the beginning as war diary, her daughter-in-law or beginning as manuscript journal. Her daughter-in-law Antoinette's baby book is titled The Brett Family, while it largely focuses on just one member of the family, her oldest son. And the other collection of scrapbooks made by Oliver Brett is referred to as tombs. By using these terms then, they imbued a sense of permanence and authority in the value of these collections. The naming strategies then are useful for reflecting on the significance of these items in the family, their archive, and their contribution to it by different members of the same family, stored in the family residences that you can see on the screen, but arriving onto the shelves of Churchill Archive Centre. Now, historians have begun to recover women's involvement in family archiving practices, illuminating some of the previous invisible archival labour carried out by grandmothers, mothers, aunts, and other female family members who exercised considerable autonomy in the creation and curation of family papers. This literature has tended to present female family members as typically self-effacing, emphasising the stories and experiences of others rather than themselves. This has obscured the more active ways in which women represented themselves in family archives, as well as men's involvement as family chroniclers too. Now, some of the scrapbooks in this collection reinforce this view to an extent, such as this scrapbook compiled by Antoinette Esher, the daughter of the American capitalist and philanthropist August Esher. Antoinette, a keen traveller, horsewoman and suffrage supporter, became engaged to Oliver for a second time, marrying in 1912. And it was a year later that she began this amazing scrapbook with a leather cover held together with a metal clasp. In her scrapbook, she recorded the lives of her children in an early precursor to the baby book, recording key milestones in her children's lives, birthday presents they received, anecdotes about their childhoods, as well as family photographs, accounts of holidays, Christmas cards, letters, drawing, and notes to Father Christmas. It's only possible to identify Antoinette as the scrapbook compiler by comparing the handwriting with that on her letters and longer passages written in the third person, such as relaying his mother's disappointment, her eldest son being given a negative school report. The scrapbook then supports our understanding, in this case, of some female family archiving practices, as Antoinette positions herself quietly as the family chronicler. But around a similar time, Antoinette's mother-in-law, Eleanor, who was in her early 50s, was compiling a series of scrapbooks on the First World War, which we saw at the beginning. While Antoinette marginalised her own authorial presence in her album, Eleanor did the opposite. She referred to these volumes as my manuscript journals of my years of work in France, suggesting the value that she invested in relaying her specific experiences of war. And as seen in this passage, she did not shy away from proclaiming her own role in running a series of first aid classes and being quite ahead of the trend in setting these up before the war, and then suddenly everybody joining them once the war had started. She also recorded key battles and events of war, which you can see on the right-hand side, showing the history writing function which some scrapbooks could serve for their makers. So on the left-hand side, we have accounts of her personal life, and on the right-hand side, we have the kind of broader narrative of war that she's constructing out of newspaper clippings. Now, Eleanor broke many conventions associated with both keeping diaries and scrapbooks, as she prioritised her own work whilst also offering a week-by-week account of key military developments, performing her knowledge of the conflict and her professionalism too. As an elite woman, Eleanor was unusual in foregrounding her various charitable and professional endeavours in scrapbook form. And this is just one example out of many which show how the family archive is inseparable from the professional and the personal archive too. And these books were also not compiled in haste, as she planned the composition of each and every page, labelling each item and giving it a corresponding place on the page, which you can see here with a letter that is indicated to be the second item on the page that she has labelled. Eleanor's journals then provided a place where she could openly testify and authenticate her wide-ranging contributions to the war effort. And we can simply see how a pre-formatted diaries with allocated spaces would just simply not be appropriate for containing all of this material that she wanted to record on the war. Scrapbooking here was a remarkable act of self-making, with Eleanor seizing control of her own narrative, as well as constructing a British narrative of war, in turn securing her place in the family archive. Now, perhaps Eleanor's scrapbooking activities provided inspiration to her son and heir Oliver, who appeared the most prolific scrapbooker of this family. Oliver, the third Viscount Esher from 1930, made the Esher family tomes, which covered the period from 1889 to 1960. In the early 20th century, Oliver unsuccessfully stood as the Liberal candidate for the Huntingdon seat before spending the First World War working for the War Office with the Queen's Westminster Rifles. He would also go on to be the chairman of the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings and on the General Purposes Committee of the National Trust. He was also a literary figure and very well networked in architecture and preservation circles. And during all of these activities, Oliver amassed 18 family tombs, handwriting his name largely on the front cover of each volume. Now, Oliver's son, Lionel, refers to his father's collecting activities, noting how he, quote, normally kept everything and bound it in red leather, end quote. And when writing a poem for her parents' silver wedding anniversary in 1937, Oliver's daughter, Virginia, dedicated some lines of a poem to his making of tombs. He does his tombs in abject gloom, and moves his books from room to room, and moves his books from case to case, until his purple in the face. Within the family, Oliver was then known for his scrapbooking activities and becoming a key part of his family identity in turn, to the extent it was immortalised in his children's writings and provided a source of gentle mocking. Oliver emulated the bibliographic conventions of published books, offering readers a contents page split by year and then by what he calls subdivisions, which relates to where the family resided throughout the year. He then divided the scrapbook into each month, with each month having its own handwritten section, further signalling the period and location of the section contents. And this page from the first tomb covering the period from 1889 showed that he reviewed his own compilation of material and tried to alleviate any confusion through his detailed labels, justifying why he added in certain items. And these annotations show his attention to detail and the premium he also placed on the chronological ordering of material, and justifying in some cases if he couldn't keep to that. The rigorous cross-referencing of material and the numbering of all 362 pages of his volume suggests that he wanted to make it easy to navigate around the vast array of material housed within its pages, which comprised clippings, photographs, Christmas cards, postcards, doodles, telegrams, and other ephemeral material. Framed as family tombs, then, it is perhaps unsurprising that this focuses on documenting the immediate family life of Oliver, his wife Antoinette, and his children. The opening pages of his volume, covering the years from 1913 to 17, include various photographs of the family, with family news specifically chosen as one of the categories in which Oliver categorises newspaper articles. And it shows how the scrapbook functioned more than just a record of his immediate family, though, with handwritten annotations, as you can see on this page, categorising material as family news, local news, and Eton news. And this one page represents the different worlds in which Oliver moved in: the arrival of his parents at the family's estate in Callander in Scotland, Antoinette's membership at the Windsor Forest Gymkhana Club, the movement of the family to Orchard Lee in Windsor, as documented through the change of address on Oliver's old Etonian Association newsletter. And juxtaposed next to all of this is a court case which saw one of their servants, Mabel Wells, prosecuted for the theft of a bracelet from Oliver's sister Dorothy. A later page reports on Oliver's joining of the 16th County of the London Battalion, pasted opposite a Valentine's letter from his niece Nancy. In a single page, then, he combined both personal and public accounts, affording them equal space in the pages of his family tombs. He was primarily and myopically concerned with the family's paperwork, to the extent that his family reputation partly rested on his tomb-making activities, blending the different worlds in which he and his family moved. In summary, then, what conclusions can we make from these three scrapbooks made by different members of the same family? On a basic level, the survival of so many scrapbooks shows that, whether consciously or not, scrapbooking was an elite archival tradition that generated a range of contributions to the wider family archive. In each scrapbook, we can see the maker staking their own claim, or claim for different members of the family. For Antoinette, she anticipated that readers would be interested in the early years of her eldest son, and only interested in her other children to the extent that they entered his orbit. For her husband, Oliver, he took a more holistic view of what consulted the family archive, resourcefully categorising news as it related to the different facets of family life, bringing together these different elements onto the same page. Of course, there are limitations as to how far we can extend this idea of paper equality between family members, with so many newspaper clippings focusing on Oliver's public roles. Much of the printed material, Antoinette largely situated her as a sort of supportive aristocratic wife and mother. This scrapbook collection then allows us to offer a more complicated account of family archiving practices, which muddy what has been a fairly stratified understanding of men and women's involvement. We see men taking the lead in becoming their family's memory keeper by organising, categorising, and saving material through the process of scrapbooking relating to their family as well as their own lives. For women, it not only afforded them a place to perform their roles as mothers, but also to stake their own claim and independence as valued women within and beyond the family, as they crafted their own narrative arcs, as well as the broader histories of conflicts on the First World War. So this paper then has focused on the archives of an elite family whose status has assured the survival of over 50 of their scrapbook collections here in the Churchill Archive Centre. And as I've hoped to show, they offer interesting insights also for thinking about things like the histories of war and the histories of family life. However, they also prompt questions which can be asked of the archives of less elite families too, particularly the gendering and the dynamics of everyday forms of archiving. Scrapbooks offer a different way of approaching the family archive in microcosm, revealing a more popular form of archiving and what this looked like, both the meanings at the time when they were created and in the decades which followed. Thank you.
Cherish, thank you very much. Obviously, we look forward to the PhD and then the book that comes out of the PhD, and then the website and perhaps the Netflix series. So thank you very much. Our next video is of another Cambridge postgraduate, Hannah Stovin, who's been doing an MPhil in history here.
I'm Hannah. I'm an MPhil student at the University of Cambridge, based at Murray Edwards, so just over the road from here. I'm currently researching family archiving practices. My favourite collection at Churchill I kind of came across randomly. I was trying to do some handwriting analysis, be a proper historian, and work out who had written this diary. So I thought I'd go back to this collection of letters and maybe try and trace them. It's from the collection of Roger Stevens, who was a diplomat in like the 1950s, but the letters are specifically ones written to him as a child. Interspersed with all these letters were also kind of letters that he'd written as a child, but also paintings and drawings. So it had this like overwhelming smell of watercolour paints. My specific favourite one is written from his dad, and it's written basically entirely in baby speak. So unexpected. When I was going through them and it's like, Mama, Dada, I was like, this is so crazy. It just changes everything you think about kind of like parenting in that period. And that's one of the things I like about Churchill is like for the history of childhood, which is what I'm really interested in, I think you could kind of think that maybe it doesn't have anything for you. But actually in all of these kind of individuals' archives, there is some hidden archive of childhood. So that's one of the things I really like.
And so now we go on from the papers of a diplomat, Roger Stevens, to several diplomats in person. Again, I don't know what the collective noun is. A negotiation of diplomats, an alliance, a cocktail. Okay. In any event, one thing that makes the Archive Centre unique is its wonderful and now long-standing collaboration with the British Diplomatic Oral History Programme, a programme to capture the memories of senior British diplomats and ambassadors and make the transcripts of those memories available, which we do online through our website. So to tell us more and to introduce their special guests are the people who run the British Diplomatic Oral History Programme, Professor Patrick Salmon and Lady Abby Wright. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Alan. That's a very kind introduction. And thank you for this opportunity to showcase the British Diplomatic Oral History Programme. I'm actually the Chief Historian at the Foreign, I'm going to start with these, at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, the FCDO, but I should explain that this is quite a recent institution formed by the merger of two former departments, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and the Department for International Development. Most of the people, in fact all the people we've interviewed so far worked for the FCO. So I think we'll probably be referring to that rather than the FCDO, but we'll also talk about the Foreign Office. I'm sorry about all these, but you know, need to get this right. Before I go on though, I'd like to congratulate, as many others have done, Alan and his colleagues on their 50th anniversary. You know, I've known the archive for nearly the whole of its existence and benefited greatly from it. And also for this event. It's a wonderful event. Most of all, though, I suppose I want to thank the archive for actually hosting the British Diplomatic Oral History Programme for nearly all of its existence, and that's both a physical and an online hosting. And the online presence is, of course, the one that really most people are aware of. And I think it's worth noting that the website has recently been upgraded, dramatically upgraded, and accessibility improved, especially now with the thing we've always wanted for a very long time, that's an ability to search right across the transcripts using keywords. And I've tried it out, and it's really transformed the usability of the transcripts, which now run to well over 200. So the search process has become much, much easier. The next thing I want to do, of course, is to introduce my three distinguished guests. First of all, my friend and colleague, Abby Wright, over there, who is manager of the programme. And then two former diplomats, who both happen to be heads of Cambridge colleges, who have been interviewed for the programme quite recently. Alison Rose, now principal of Newnham College, was interviewed very recently, and her transcript has only just gone online in the last few days. She's had an extremely interesting but very different career, I think, from most diplomats, as we'll learn. But she ended as ambassador to Belgium between 2014 and 2019. And then, of course, we have Simon McDonald, Lord McDonald of Salford, Master of Christ's College. In his career, he has served as ambassador to Israel and to Germany, and he ended his career as permanent Under-Secretary of State at the FCDO and head of the diplomatic service from 2015 to 2020. What we plan to do over the next hour or so is first, I'll ask Abby to speak for a few minutes about the programme, what we try to do, how we do it, and some of the challenges perhaps that we encounter along the way. And then I'll invite our two other panellists to talk about their careers and the experience of being recorded. First Alison and then Simon. And I suppose the sort of questions we'll be asking them to think about are, what did it feel like after your retirement from the FCO to prepare for an interview like this, to talk about yourself at length to an interviewer, and then perhaps to read the transcript of what you'd said. What was it like to do that? And what was the significance of that experience for you personally and the people reading the transcripts? Did it help you perhaps place your career in perspective? What would people reading the transcript know about the diplomatic life and Britain's external affairs that they didn't know before? I hope that might take about half an hour, leaving plenty of time for members of the audience to ask questions. Especially, I think we'd like to hear from people who've used the archive. It would be very interesting to know how, if possible, how the oral history has been fitted into your broader understanding of Britain's foreign affairs. So that's where I'll conclude my introduction, and then I'll ask Alison perhaps to speak first. Thank you.
Patrick.
Sorry, my mistake. Abby first. I got it wrong. Abby first. Sorry about that.
I'd just like to add my great thanks to Alan and his team, and especially to our wonderful archivist, Catherine Thompson, who looks after the BDOHP when it arrives here in transcript form with so much patience and care and support. And we just couldn't manage without you, Catherine. Thank you. The programme, which has been briefly outlined, is run by a voluntary organisation. We're all volunteers, from Patrick down to all our recorders. And it's an archive of recollections of senior retired British diplomats. And we now have 230 transcripts. We hope 250 by the end of the autumn. We were founded in 1995 by retired Diplomatic Service Officer Malcolm McBain, who sadly died last year. But after many successful and productive years, by 2013, things had stalled a little bit. But after a chance meeting between Patrick and I at a book launch, I think, in the Foreign Office, we put our heads together and decided to set about reviving it. We established a mission, and our mission is to provide oral history which will assist our users to get behind the documents and try and answer the many questions that the facts themselves may not. And to achieve the same, we set a number of new processes in place. Firstly, we slightly changed the mindset. We think of the diplomats we are recording as our subjects, and we see ourselves as their recorders. We see ourselves as facilitators, not interrogators. We believe when our subjects are at their most relaxed and confident that we will look after them carefully, we get the most out of them. However, at a seminar here in 2017, Professor David Reynolds urged us not to be too self-effacing. It was an extremely useful seminar, and it gave us lots of advice. So we do try and ask the difficult questions too, but we try and get the balance right. For many of our subjects, they're not going to go on to write books. So these recollections are their legacies of careers of great service, and we hold that in a lot of respect, and we feel we should be very careful with that. When this confidence and rapport is established, we think we're getting the best result. The other major change, we felt we wanted, no two transcripts are the same, no two people's careers are the same, no people's recollections are the same, but we wanted to establish a standard so that everybody was dealt with as they wanted to be dealt with. So we requested our subjects to prepare career outlines before we start. The career outline gives the subject a chance to think about what they're going to talk about, our recorders a chance to do a bit of light research, the Foreign Office historians have the opportunity to put their input, ask questions, guide the recorders, because our recorders are not historians. And also the document serves as a skeleton to guide through the recording sessions, which we call recording sessions, not interviews. We recruited and trained a small team of recorders, and I think our recorders are our heroes, because without them, we really wouldn't exist. Our recorders are made up of some members of the retired diplomatic service, some spouses, but also we have a scientist and a judge, and but they all have a great interest and love in international relations. Our recorders do all their own transcriptions, which is the real heavy lifting of the programme. For every hour of recording, it is probably 4 hours of transcribing. So it's a lot of work. Challenges. Diplomats are all, to a man and a woman, great drafters. Indeed, one might say it might even be a common vanity. They love their drafting. It's very important to them. And oral history can be a bit of a shock when they read it for the first time, because, oh, I don't write like that. I don't speak like that. So we do have to be careful that our subjects aren't too tempted to re-edit too much of their recollections, because as many of you who know all about oral history will know, if you fiddle with it too much, you knock the stuffing out of the oral history, but it isn't as good a written work if you'd started with a blank sheet of paper. So that's one challenge. The other great challenge for an organisation that runs on a face-to-face recording basis was the COVID pandemic. It really, we thought, how are we going to cope with this? We had great luck in one of our recorders, Ian Hay Campbell, was, before he became a midlife officer in the Foreign Office, had been a radio journalist. So he taught us a few tricks of the trade on how to work on the online platforms. And I'm pleased to say that we managed to file 25 transcripts during COVID, including that of Simon McDonald. I think Patrick has mentioned the exciting new web pages, and I think we must say thanks at this point to the generosity of our founders' family, the McBain Family Foundation, who gave a donation to help us contribute towards the improvement of these pages that now tell a lot more about us and are going, we hope, in the not too distant future, we'll be able to attach audio clips from our recordings to bring our oral history alive, because we are, after all, an oral history programme. Mirroring the move within the Foreign Office itself to promote more diversity, we're delighted to be including very more female diplomats in our collection. And the very latest, as Patrick has mentioned, is Alison, whose transcript joined us, I think, yesterday or today, and it's a great read. While not abandoning our criteria to record senior diplomats, we do try to extend into other areas, and we're hoping to record some locally employed staff who are abroad, now thanks to our use of online platforms, as well as targeting key issues. We're specifically trying to target Brexit at the moment and geographical regions like China, Russia, and Ukraine. We've got a transcript of an officer who served in our Taiwan office about to join the collection, and that's a first for us. So we're very excited about what comes next, but that's quite enough from me. So over to our speakers to tell you what it's like to be one of our victims. Thank you.
Thank you. I knew about the FCDO Oral History Project because I'd consulted it when I needed to do background research on the number of people I was interviewing. But no one could have been more surprised than me to find an email from Abby pop into the box saying, would I like to be part of it? Because although I worked in the Foreign Office for about 17 years, I was never actually a career diplomat. But talking to Abby and looking at the spread of my time, particularly working on European Union matters, 1989 to 2019, I could see that there might be a gap there or that I could fill, and that in a sense I'm representative of those many civil servants from other government departments who spent varying lengths of time seconded to the Foreign Office, particularly during our EU membership, particularly in the UK permanent representation in Brussels. And a number of us went on to do other things for the Foreign Office. Sean Morgan became our ambassador in Argentina, John Kittmer in Greece, and then, as you heard, I became our ambassador to Belgium. I was interviewed probably about a 3-year gap after I'd left, which I think was the right time for me. I found, I think, a lot of these times that are quite pressured, you cope with them at the time, but afterwards it was a long while before I could read anything about Brexit. Although I wasn't in right at the end, the final 3 years of my career were pretty dominated by Brexit. It obviously got a lot more intense, as we've seen from the Laura Koonsberg documentary screening, but even the 3 years I experienced, it was very, very intense. It's only really more recently that I've been able to read things like Gavin Barwell's autobiography of his time as Theresa May's Chief of Staff, and Craig Oliver's account of the referendum time itself. So it was helpful for me to have that bit of time to reflect. I decided, perhaps because many years ago I was a historian, I tried to be as factual as possible. I think that was potentially a little bit frustrating to my wonderful interviewer who wanted to press me for my views on the Iraq War. I wasn't entirely sure what an EU specialist had to offer, why my view on that was anymore, so I'm afraid we stayed a little bit factual, a little bit Euro-techy, but I hope that will be of interest to the historians. But it did enable me to reflect on connections that I either saw at the time, so just how it's very easy if one wants to see Brexit as failure, to pin it on one prime minister or another, but actually I think there were failures of communication, failures of understanding of the British mood, failures of appreciation of the importance of communicating what was going on in the EU and what we were benefiting. That stretched a long period over a number of prime ministers and a number of administrations, and it's not unique to British ministers to want to take the credit for all good things that the EU did and blame them for anything that goes wrong. But it did also enable me to reflect, and again this is a bit Euro-techy, so forgive me, on the parallels between the negotiation the EU did with Ireland to get a second referendum on the Lisbon Treaty, and then what they thought they might get away with David Cameron later. So being recorded gave me the chance, and I thought those were reflections that were perhaps worth including. I wanted to give a reflection of what life in the UK permanent representation was like for a jobbing desk officer, but also what life was like as an ambassador. I suspect my transcript will have the least on foreign policy in it of any of the transcripts, but I hope I've reflected the breadth of things that an ambassador covers, the trade and investment work, the counter-terrorism work, the migration work. You are responsible, you're a mini Whitehall in a sense, you're responsible not just to your parent department, but to the wider Whitehall, and that is the joy and the interest of the job, whatever happened to be the live issues between the UK and your country at the time. I think the way the transcripts are done, I hear the problems about editing, but I'm afraid I felt the fact that I was able to edit made me to push my boundaries a little bit more in the transcript, perhaps pull back just a little bit. And I'm afraid posterity will be very pleased I was able to edit out so many so's and reallys. And I've spoken, as Simon has far more extensive than me, to the House of Commons, where your Hansard takes you word for word, and who you realise quite how badly most of us speak. But it was great to be able to do some light editing and just think, is that fair to X or fair to Y? So I found it a really fascinating experience. I'm very grateful to my interviewer and to Abby and Patrick for inviting me to be part of this amazing project. Over to Simon.
Thank you very much, Alison. Well, my experience was rather different from yours, and I sort of gather my thoughts into 5 little groups. The first is about speed, because unlike Alison, I did my transcript, my interviews, very soon after I left the Foreign Office. So you said yours was 3 years, mine I think was 3 weeks. And I did this for 2 main reasons. One was that I'd left the Foreign Office and I had nothing else to do, and there was another lockdown, so why not? And secondly, because Peter Ricketts, one of my predecessors as PUS, advised that doing it quick was better than waiting, that freshness of these recollections is important. So, a different experience from Alison's. Second, my main memory of the sessions, which were 3 and were very long. I think I was talking to Ian Hay Campbell for 9 hours altogether, so I shudder to think how much work he then had to do. My main recollection is it was completely unsupported. So I had access to absolutely no papers as I was doing this. And that's sort of a high wire act. But my advice to anybody using this resource is to bear this in mind, because by definition, the people who are recollecting cannot draw on official papers. So this is what you best remember rather than what you most accurately remember. The third thing was that even though the recollections were personal and actually quite chatty, the security side of government still took a rather close interest, and a rather, if I may say, annoying, nitpicking interest. And so all sorts of things which I thought were completely harmless were blue penciled by somebody else. And I just note that anybody reading this should bear in mind that this is not in the end unalloyed, because somebody has looked at it through a very precise national security lens. The fourth thing is about accuracy. But I think in any case, we are unreliable witnesses to our own lives. We tend to give ourselves the benefit of the doubt. We are generally the heroes of our own story. I've never read a memoir that said, in this crucial meeting, I was a load of rubbish, I forgot my lines, or I screwed things up, and our case was put back 6 months by my personal inadequacy. And yet that does happen in real life. So I think you have to be very careful with these histories. Just the fact that they're personal and they're raw does not mean they are higher quality. So this leads me to my fifth and final reflection. Aware of all that and abiding by Ian Hay Campbell's stricture that the editing should be very light, I thought I want to do something more. And because lockdown persisted, I started to write a first book. And the first book really grew out of that witness statement because it was a reflection on my career. I got to the top of the Foreign Office. I asked myself, why was that? And I concluded that the people I worked for and the values, the practices they embodied in the first half of my career absolutely shaped the second half of my career, which I thought would be of some interest to other people. And then having written that book, and it's nice and complete, my best friend said, well, Simon, that's all very interesting reminiscence, but what about foreign policy? Because I'd spent a long time working on foreign policy, and George thought I should write about that. So I did. So my second book appears in November. It's called Beyond Britannia. If anybody wants to buy it, it's available for pre-order now. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Simon. Thanks for the plug. We'll look out for that. There's so much already that I think we've learned from two actually remarkably contrasting presentations, and almost everything imaginable was different, and yet they were both, extraordinarily illuminating. I must just say, you could almost start taking your phones out and scroll through both of them, but Alison is so new, and I've never read a clearer description of what it's like to work in Europe, and actually how successful we were, but actually also, Alison, how we undersold ourselves and ministers didn't turn up at meetings and that sort of thing. That was really interesting. It makes you realise what opportunities were lost. And Simon, I think the speed with which you did it was, it was like Peter Ricketts had said you should do that. He did that. And actually Simon Fraser, his predecessor, also did it very quickly. And I don't know whether it's PUSs have some special need to get these things out very, very soon after they retire. But maybe actually, it was good that it was definitely good that you did that. Perhaps I could just maybe start kicking off a question, really. I mean, you then used your book to reflect, but is there much that you felt you were holding back in that first interview that you did?
Yeah. There was stuff that was still personally difficult, disagreeable, but I didn't feel much like sharing. I mean, I don't think it's necessary for the historical record, but it was important to me. But I kept that to myself. And if you're wondering, it's about my second posting in Saudi Arabia. And the little hint I will give is that it's the only time in my life I've been accused of conspiracy to murder. And that was a wounding experience, but a personal experience.
Yes, I remember reading about that, and another thing people should check out on their phones if they can. I actually had a rather more lightweight question, which I think I could address to both of you. First, to Alison, perhaps. You both read history at Cambridge. I think, Alison, you were just a year after Simon. What was it? Was there anything in your Cambridge education, your historical tripos, that helped you in your career, led you to a diplomatic career, perhaps, and then helped you during that career?
Funnily enough, we were looking at what is the use of history during the Alumni Festival this weekend. We had a Newnham conversation, which my former Director of Studies, Jill Sutherland, led. And one of the things we were reflecting on is just how useful and so relevant today, assessing evidence, looking for bias, and looking at the sort of broadest perspective as to making sure you're looking at the widest possible context. I mean, I think there's always a sense in any policy work that looking at what's gone before is helpful, but I think particularly in diplomacy, understanding the relationship between your country and the country you're posted to, both the good things, the Belgians like to say to me that we were the only country who hadn't invaded them, which I thought showed a lack of historical knowledge, because that might be true since 1831, but it certainly wasn't true for Belgium's predecessors. But on the other hand, some of them never really forgave us for vetoing Luc de Haene as commission president. In fact, I think we might have vetoed 2 Belgians as commission presidents, and someone had to be aware of that, particularly in dealing with some of the older people, where the sensitivities were. Where the corns were. It was particularly funny during the bicentenary of Waterloo, which of course the Brits wanted to make into this great sort of drama. Britain come to save the world, and you had to sort of remind them the Germans played quite a big role in that. And actually to be a little bit careful, because some of the Belgians had preferred Napoleon to the Dutch who came afterwards. So just that sort of historical context. And then it obviously became much more important in terms of negotiations, particularly on Brexit, to understand some of the history, to understand why, in my case, Belgium took the particular approach it did to EU matters. So, yes, I think it was extremely useful preparation.
Simon, same question.
My ambition to be a diplomat predated my arrival at Cambridge. And so I was already in my head in 1979 that I wanted to join the Foreign Office. I was then 18, I suppose I put my papers in when I was 17. The last important decision in my life, which I let my parents take on my behalf, was which subject I should read here. So law was their preference, and so I applied to read law. I did law for 4 days and thought, why am I doing this? Actually, there is a very strong link between law and diplomacy, but as a callow 18-year-old, I thought history would be more relevant. And so I think our first lecture was on a Thursday, and on the Monday morning I swapped to history and never regretted the switch.
Did you get much from that experience in the next
3 years?
Yeah,
I mean, some of it was... it felt eerily, directly applicable. So the special paper I did in the third year was done by Clive Trebilcoe at Pembroke about the arms race before the First World War. Well, you know, the names are different, but the motivations and the pathology, the trajectory was very similar nearly a century later.
I think we've reached the point where we could invite questions from the floor, and I'll do my best. I can see one right up there straight away, another one quite close, so that's 2. We'll start with those 2 anyway.
At the back?
Yep, up there.
Hi, this is Bonnie Soames. This is a question for Lady Wright, because I was one of the first podcasters, and I did lots of podcasts with a team, with Women in Parliament, and Churchill has one of the archives. But I can relate, Lady Wright, to what you said about when people see what they've said, the spoken word, as opposed to the drafted word. But as a sort of experienced interviewer, print, radio and TV journalism, the but critical question is a really important one. You said David had emphasised that, because I'm quite sceptical of allowing people to tell their own histories without the but question, because it can help the interviewee, because the but question is a release for them. It's not a criticism. But do you think that you incorporate enough of the but questions into your interviews?
Yes. The but. Sometimes, when we're interviewing the very elderly subjects, the but can slightly knock them sideways and we lose it. The but can also be very effective and get more than sometimes what the subject actually wants to share. If the subject is not comfortable with what they've said, then our transcripts can get stuck, because we can't release a transcript until our subjects are happy to sign papers for us to use them. So we have to be careful. But we do ask the arbats, and it's a matter of judgment, I think, for each interview. Because there's nothing worse than having a wonderful interview and then not being able to release it. Sorry, it's a bit of a...
No, thank you, that's very helpful. And do both of you ever put a time on the release? Because that's what we've done with certain interviews in the British Library, where the politicians had to sign them off, because the British Library requires that. But they then said, well, it can't be released for 70 years or something.
No, most of our interviews, some of the ones that were interviewed under our previous, before Patrick and I took over in 2013, some of them are sealed because people had chosen for that to be done. But we don't actually do that. We release them as they're done. Sometimes if something has been redacted by the office, but the subject feels very strongly that should stay in, and we feel very strongly it should be in, we do have the possibility of sealing it here at Churchill. And I mentioned at the end of my words that we have a piece coming up from an officer who served in our Taiwan office. There's a little piece in that is still considered sensitive and not in the public domain. So that is going to be sealed and kept here and revisited in 10 years' time.
Thank you, fascinating.
And it's happy.
Hi, thanks so much, Simon and Alison. Jess Gardner, University Librarian for Cambridge. I think he's left now, but Lord Botang asked a great question yesterday, reflecting some history work on dispatches, diplomatic dispatches, regretting the loss, as I understand it, of the last dispatch or the valedictory dispatch. And I wonder what your reflections are on that loss, and whether the Oral History Programme is in any way an opportunity to make that a last dispatch.
I think it was probably a sign of things to come in terms of, certainly on very, very sensitive issues. I mean, I reflect in my transcript about once trust breaks down, and clearly, you know, how much trust had broken down, both within, particularly in the May government, you don't get very good policy making because everything gets sort of kept to a very, very small group of people who can be allegedly trusted with the information. So certainly under Brexit, you know, you very rarely put anything on that in a telegram. You had a letter that you wrote very, very carefully who you sent it to, and I'm afraid that the Kim Darroch affair just sort of confirmed that with a lot of people. And the danger there is that exactly what you want from your ambassadors, which is fairly unholds-barred stuff, if it's not politically correct, then... so I think the valedictory telegram went a little bit that way. Also, I mean, some of them were a little bit, it seemed as a non-diplomat at the time, reading some of them in my first posting in UCREP, some of them did seem to want to be a chance to sort of put the boot in for various sort of things that the person thought should have happened and hadn't happened. So I think you're right. I think the transcript is a chance to get some of those more reflective perspectives.
I think dispatches were a great part of what diplomats, what the Foreign Office used to do, because they were a chance to reflect more deeply, and they were generally worked on quite hard by their authors, and so they were written with a wider perspective and the future readers in mind. And for a long time, I think it worked in the system. One of the steps down where they became more controversial and more suspect was in 1979, when Nico Henderson retired from Paris, and amazingly, his valedictory dispatch, which might have been called a manifesto, appeared in The Economist, And Margaret Thatcher read it and liked it, and shortly afterwards he was named ambassador to Washington, so it kind of worked for him. But this lodged this in the ideas of diplomats and politicians as something that might have more than one use. And as Alison says, as the years went by, more of these things began appearing in the public domain, and they basically had a couple of disagreeable things, if you were the leadership in the office or political leaders, in common. They were all carping, and they were all written by men and women who should have been listened to more carefully. And at some point, the leadership got bored of that and said, enough, no more of these. And I remember that point absolutely precisely because I'd just written my valedictory dispatch from Tel Aviv. So this was the summer of 2006. And I was just about to press send when I received my very first telephone call as ambassador in Israel from the permanent secretary of the day. This is very, very kind of him to phone me on my final day to say thank you for all my work. No, it wasn't. Peter Ricketts was a very kind man, but he forgot to say thank you. What he did say was, have you written a valedictory dispatch? To which I said, yes. And then he said, don't send it. And I said, well, I've written it now, Peter, so I would like some people to read this. And we negotiated a list of 6 people who were allowed to read it. So it's rather like Alison's experience later doing the EU negotiation, that in the Foreign Office used to be about broadcasting your message around the whole organisation, so the whole organisation was in the know. Latterly, it has become very, very much more targeted, so that you try to make sure that the people, and only the people who need to know, are in the know.
Brilliant answers, thank you.
That reminds me that now and again you come across a dip tell, which are now called, which is labelled not a valedictory, and at the end they make some valedictory comments. So there are ways of getting around it. There was somebody right at the back. 2 people had their hands up at the back. So we'll go to those 2 first, then down here. I should look at this side of the room more. I will in a minute.
I just wanted to ask, when you're doing these reflections, how do you balance your current perspective in the moment of recording on events of the past and how you felt in the moment when you're describing these careers?
Alison, would you like to try that?
Gosh. Well, unlike Simon, and this may be a sign of how things have moved on, I was able to do a bit of fact-checking about dates and things, which it's almost a sort of a process of reflecting with the evidence. I mean, it was something like the renegotiation that was done with the Irish over the Lisbon Treaty. That's a matter of record. You can find that very easily on the intranet. And reading that again, that set the light bulbs in my memory of thinking, oh, that was what was sensitive to us. So for me, it was a sort of two-way process, really, that I wanted to do a bit of research to jog my memory. But I suppose I was trying to, and this is where you are trying, I suppose, to put your own spin on things, but trying to make sure people have got insights into things which, not that I was particularly special, but just I was probably the only person who was doing that bit at the time who was going to be recorded. So trying to put something there that may not, probably because it's far too detailed, be picked up by anybody else. So I hope it's been helpful to the record, rather than if I just relied on my memory of exactly what the key issues were in the Lisbon Treaty, without jogging my memory through looking at the actual document. I'm not sure. Likewise, I'd kept some, I mean, nothing I wasn't supposed to keep, but I'd kept some of the stuff around the EU referendum bill, which just reminded me of some of the key phrases we used. So I suppose I was sort of reflecting a bit on some written evidence.
I would say everything was infused with the feelings of now. I don't pretend that I was capturing feelings from before, from when the moment stuff happened. But in making the choice of things to record, events that have made a deep, deep impression at the time, they were more likely to surface in the memory and the account later. One particular memory was around German unification. I was a second secretary in Bonn, and I remember clearly being very, very frustrated with how crap the leadership of the embassy was, how slow they were, how they weren't talking to the right people. And, in those days, in an embassy of several hundred people, I just fulminated with my friends and couldn't think how to engage with these really good and able and clueless senior leadership. That is preserved somewhere in one of my accounts.
Just behind you, Paul Kennedy.
Paul Kennedy from Yale. Where we have been doing for about the past 20 years a really interesting and very detailed oral history of the United Nations, including interviews with pretty well every one of the Secretaries General and many of the head support staff of the United Nations. So that caused me to wonder, Patrick, whether you or any of the others on the panel have any idea of if there's a French diplomatic oral history being pursued by the Quai d'Orsay, or whether the State Department is allowing their diplomats to be interviewed in some sort of long-standing project as well. In other words, that some 40 or 50 years in the future, the comparative historian, might look at Simon McDonald's account of his glowing, wonderful interview with the French ambassador, but then be able to see the oral interview with the French ambassador about his version of how brilliant he was when he was talking with Simon. So, is there anyone trying to bring together some information about where the oral histories programs are occurring in other countries and other organizations?
I think that's a really interesting question. I can answer it partly anyway. I mean, for instance, the British diplomatic oral history program was created partly on the model of an American program, which has been running a long time. I can't remember the details now, but a lot of State Department officials have been interviewed. And there are other programs in the United States which actually have programs to interview very, very senior policymakers, even presidents. And we had a seminar about a couple of years ago on what we called elite oral history here at Churchill. And we had American and British participants in that. The history of Parliament, for instance, in Britain does it as well. I have in the past spoken to French people about the idea that the Quai d'Orsay could run a program. I don't know whether they ever did. The difference with us is that it's not the Foreign Office running this thing, and I think it's extremely important that it's not officially. I know I work for the Foreign Office, but I have nothing to do with. It's nothing to do with my day job. I think it's extremely important that it should be independent. Having said that, Simon, I think we might come back to this question of redaction and censorship towards the end. But
can I add one point for Paul, which is that when my first ambassadorship in Israel, one of my pieces of advice to my team when recording things, especially their triumphs, was imagine how the French embassy would report this to Paris and so dial it down.
I think the next, I've got one, Stephen Wright first, then down here, that's the next two.
Yes, my name is Stephen Wright. I should declare an interest in that I have not only do I see a lot of this in-house, but I have contributed a set of recollections to the BDOHP process, so I have been a victim of it as well. Permit me a comment as well as a question. A comment, firstly, this hasn't been said yet, but it's always seemed to me that part of the value of the BDOHP collection of recollections is that it enables so many different viewpoints to be brought together for the researchers on specific foreign policy issues. Because foreign policy issues have a tendency to be multi-annual to go on over a long period of time. So you have a number of British colleagues who have worked on it at different times. And secondly, they span a lot of different capitals. So you will get different perspectives in different capitals on the same issue. And that, it seems to me, must be of potential interest to researchers as well. My question is this. Alison referred to the issue of trust. What do both Simon and Alison, what was their experience of operating and in particular reporting in this period of declining trust between officials and ministers? How much has the quality of diplomatic reporting suffered as a result?
Alison's inviting me to go first on this one. This is clearly a critically important issue. Through my career, right to the end of my career, I never wrote anything that a minister would not want to read. I mean, we work for them. I'm not saying there weren't conversations where I think, what on earth is going on? What is Minister or Junior Minister X up to? But it just wasn't necessary, I felt, to put it in writing, to put it into the record. And I think the system worked well enough because I think the political leadership knew that. But now I'm hesitating at adding because, of course, I have retired now. And in retirement, I know I've said things at the political level absolutely hates and thinks that this is a betrayal of the practice whilst serving. And that has been very difficult personally because I do feel that continuing loyalty for myself, but I also feel the colleagues still at work are being judged by my behaviour in retirement. And even though I think that is unfair, there's evidence that is happening. But my self-justification is that some of the things that were happening were so awful, and some politicians were so badly exploiting the traditional silence of civil servants that I thought, no, there's something more important than that. I owe no loyalty to your extreme bad behaviour.
Can you follow that?
I think, obviously, Simon being that much more senior and being still in post after 2019, I can't sort of comment on that particular period, but I do feel, looking back, really, I think, certainly from 2010, the split within the Conservative Party became rancorous so early that it did mean that those civil servants who did manage to get the trust of ministers felt they had to guard that, even with Prime Ministers like Cameron and May, very, very closely. And that meant we weren't always getting, I mean, I think we probably both had experiences at different times of learning more about what the British position was from the people you were talking with from the host country than you were learning from London, because there was this bizarre feeling that you weren't sort of, I think having now read more of Gavin Barwell, I realise it wasn't actually just us who weren't trusting, it was nobody could be trusted. But it really doesn't create good policy making. I mean, again, getting into the detail, some of the things around the fiscal compact, there was to me anyway, Simon much better able to comment, but a deafness to what the German position was going to be. Just didn't want to hear. It was all going to be all right. Merkel was going to come through on the night. And nobody wanted to sort of feed in that, well, hang on a minute, Germany will put what's good for Germany first. So I think that's a problem when you do get. I think it's always been true, and I can say this as a mainstream civil service. If you've got this range of policy options, you fairly quickly learn that if you try and do that to a minister, you may not be listened to, but you might need to do that, or you might need to do that. But when it comes to that all that, then that's not evidence-based policy making.
Really interesting. Thank you. Jim, I think down here. Adrian, did you also want to? Yeah, up. Yeah.
According to the old saying, the ambassador traditionally had a very important responsibility, which was to lie on behalf of his country. In this day when political leaders so often want to do the negotiating themselves, and Churchill certainly had some part in making that transition, is there a frustration often being an ambassador for that reason?
I think generally relationship building is important, and anything that helps relationship building. I mean, one of the things in my transcript is perhaps that didn't enough happen in EU negotiations. I think where embassies still have a role, and we have to play that very sensibly, is just trying to give the wider political context. I mean, for a long while, the Treasury was very, very powerful in any sorts of EU negotiations. But often what we're trying to give the memory of, yes, you may call the shots in the UK, but actually the Finance Ministry may not be as powerful, or actually they're in a coalition of 4 parties. So you may be talking to Minister X, but he's got X, Z, and A, and B, and C. So hopefully one could always give that sort of wider context. But yes, I mean, finding out what was being said, I think, I never minded people talking. That was good if there were those sort of relationships, but just trying to make sure that you knew what was going on.
I would say that the frustrations have been cumulative over centuries, and one reason for them is change technology. So when ambassadors were first sent, they were really plenipotentiary as well as extraordinary, because they were weeks away from a conversation with their capital. So they had to do things themselves. And of course, they were very conscious of the guardrails, as Henry Wotton learned when he was sacked by James I after his witticism. But they certainly had greater scope in the past. And you're right, ministers like to be more hands-on these days, and because of technology they think they can be. But because the world is so complicated and so fast-moving, and ministers are trying to get across so many different briefs, I think the expert on the ground can still find a pretty worthwhile job, because the minister is never, ever able to give the sustained attention that a really knotty negotiation needs. And so the negotiators on the spot are still key.
I think we'll add some questions together. Adrian here, then up the back there. That's 2. Any more questions before we... 3. Right. The last 3.
Thank you. Adrian Chris, Churchill College. My concern is about all oral history projects, and I'm referring to false memory syndrome. We are well aware that people can conjure up memories which did not, they're not in any way trying to deceive, but they're producing something from within their own brain that they've synthesized. Maybe the misinterpretation of dreams and all sorts of things. Did that really happen? Or did I imagine it? Or did I dream it? I'll just give one example of that. I've been reading recently quite a lot about those going on the Peenemünde raid in 1943 to attack the V base, the source of the V weapons there. And those who were interviewed going on the raid consistently described that they were briefed that they were going to attack a dangerous, secret German rocket base, and their job was to destroy it, and they had to destroy it at all costs. Now, we know quite independently that they were not briefed about that. That was top secret. They were not told they were going on such a raid in any way, but these chaps synthesized this false memory. And I'm sure diplomats are not subject to false memory syndrome, but it's something worth asking whenever one considers oral history programs. Thank you.
Next, right the way up there, please. The back of the room.
I will say very briefly whilst the microphone is going, diplomats are subject to this, for sure they are, and including collectively. My guide would be treat especially carefully anything that reflects especially well on the person who's speaking.
I think that we'll take that as a good enough answer. Thank you.
And there wouldn't be a role for historians if one didn't have to look at evidence and find inconsistencies and biases. So.
Yeah, that is their job.
I'm Jess Mickelson, I'm a historian at the National Archives, and I wonder, given the discussions we've had this morning about the insights diplomatic spouses might have and the soft power that they might yield, whether there's any potential or any plans to expand the Oral History Project to include their contributions.
Thank you. And one more right down the front, Piers.
I just wanted to pay tribute to Malcolm McBain, who brought the Diplomatic Oral History Project to us. I think without his tenacity and his real interest in the subject, we would have lacked it. And I was worried when he first brought it, because I felt that we were in danger of getting something which was a bit like intelligence history, which would tell us everything that we wanted to know about diplomatic history, apart from what we really wanted to know, which was the real story behind the real story. And we've heard, to some extent, the worries that people who've been subjected to this, to the Foreign Office vetting, have been subjected to. And I think that really all I have to say is that Malcolm was a great one for wanting to get this story, but I think really the price of liberty is eternal vigilance on this particular subject, because if you let the Foreign Office get its way, we shall all be hearing the reportage of Sir Humphrey Appleby and not the real story.
I think those last questions are more addressed to you and me, Abby. Yes.
But I still have something to say.
Right, okay. I'll let you go first then.
Oh, right, okay. I agree very strongly that the scope needs to be widened. And I'm going to make publicly an offer to Abby and to Patrick, because my mother-in-law and my wife both lived the diplomatic life and have a distinctive perspective. And I was very intrigued when my father-in-law was writing his recollections, how violently his wife disagreed with him. And of course, he had the final say. And one anecdote was from Washington in the early 1960s, when Patrick, as a first secretary in the embassy, had a meeting with President Kennedy in the Oval Office. This does not happen anymore. But what happened in that meeting is very differently remembered by the two Wright members of my family. So, and explore that.
Yes, we would love to interview more diplomatic spouses. I have actually interviewed one, the widow of the late Dick Vigus Walker. Dick started his recollections and went on a brief holiday, and sadly died before he could complete them. And I thought, well, this was such a wonderful story. We really do have to complete his recollections as best we can. And so I interviewed Gabby Vigus Walker, his widow, who did bring a different perspective to it. And as I did it, I thought, oh, if we had some more recorders, we could do much more of this. So I guess our plea is to everybody listening out there, in the room and out there, if anybody is interested in joining the British Diplomatic Oral History Programme as a recorder, to please get in touch with me and we could explore it further, because if we have more people, we can record more recorders, we can record more people, and there's absolutely no reason why we, I think, couldn't record some more spouses.
Yes, definitely, I quite agree.
On the redactions, but I think Patrick will probably want to say more, but what I would say about our sensitivity reviews is they do exercise a very light touch. I mean, there aren't huge chunks of our original transcripts being locked away. It is a very light touch. And we can save them and we can seal them. So nothing is lost for forever.
I mean, are we allowed to say there's only two things that people cut out, really. One is references to royalty, and the other is the intelligence agencies. Those are the two things that regularly get trimmed, if you like, but not always completely removed. It isn't the Foreign Office who's trying to do this. It is other parts of the British establishment, if I can put it that way. As Abby says, nothing's lost forever. Everything is there somewhere. It's never completely removed. I'm conscious, Alan, that we have run out of time, but it's been a real privilege and a pleasure to have Alison and Simon here. And actually, I think we must thank them for their candour. They've been really open and honest with us, and it's really fulfilled all my hopes for this session. So thank you very much.